Good morning, everyone. We're at 9:30, so the hearings can resume. Today we're dealing with matter 6 that relates to non-residential strategic sites. Numbers are few today. We've had a couple of people drop out. Mr. Langler from Historic England and Mr. Merritt's not going to be with us, so I'm not sure we need to go around the table. I think we all know each other, don't we? Mr. Wood, good morning. Carol, I suppose we should do housekeeping for the sake of completeness.
Right. Fire, there's no scheduled fire alarm test during the planning inquiry, so if the alarm does sound, please make your way to the nearest exit, which will be at the front, and meet at the corner of Claremont Terrace outside the GMB building, which is to your left. Do not stop to retrieve any belongings, but exit the building as quickly and safely as possible following the green exit routes, and do not enter the building until a fire marshal or member of the fire service tells you it's safe to do so. Door security, please use the main doors to access and exit the building. For security purposes, do not use the side doors unless you are a wheelchair user and someone is available to unlock and relock the door after you. Don't let anybody into the building that you don't know, please. And York City Church or Citadel staff are generally available to ask if you're unsure. There are other building users in the building at the time, so just sort of be mindful of that, please. The toilets are situated on the ground floor on the corridor at the back of that wall there. If you need any attention, please let the Citadel staff know. We've got drinking water all around the table, and if anybody does have any issues, not just with water or anything else in view of the red alert today, if you just let me know or contact somebody from the council. And there's also water in the foyer for members of the public, but don't think we've got anybody in. There's refreshments are available around the coffee shops around Gillygate, and also there's a Sainsbury's Express on Bootham. Just to remind people that the sessions are being filmed, so if anyone does have any issues, let me know and we can sort the seating out. Also, there's Wi-Fi for the building, and the details are on the posters either side of the room. It's Citadel Guest, and the password is General Booth 1883. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. Well, I don't think we need to. There's anything else we need to cover, and we can get straight into the questions. I propose to deal with these. I hope this is okay. On a site-by-site basis. I think that seems the sensible way to do it. And if we deal with greenbelt boundaries while we're talking about each particular site where it's relevant, I think we can do that all together. I'm going to start with policy SS21 and allocation ST26. I don't know if, Mr. Elvin, there was anything you wanted to say in opening about that.
Yes. Well, Mr. Wood and I were discussing the allocation policies in the light of Mr. Jukes' concerns about the criteria, and we are certainly agreed that a number of the criteria are either surplus to requirements or not required. And I was just telling Mr. Jukes which ones we agreed as you were coming in. In SS21, i.e. Elvington, the historic field boundaries, there's no justification for the inclusion of that. If there were any issue, it could be tied up under landscaping.
Landscaping anyway, yeah.
The light pollution, etc. issues, if there are issues, they'll be picked up in the normal development management way, but there is no specific reason to have them here. And archaeological deposits, absolutely correct. We've got a freestanding policy for development management purposes, which I think is D6. So, yes, we do. In which case, that can go as well.
That cut short some of the questions I had.
I'll hand over to Mr. Wood.
Mr. Wood, then.
Thank you. I guess in brief summary, sorry, put my microphone on. Sorry. In brief summary, this site has been through the site selection approach that's set out in the Council's hearing statement, so it's been through that site selection process and the various criteria that it's been through, as well as that, as set out in the Employment Land Review, which does helpfully explain the site selection approach. I think you've been through the sort of 4 stages of the site selection under other hearing sessions. Obviously, we've set that out again in the hearing statement, but I won't repeat that unless you need me to. I think the other thing to flag up is that what's also set out in the Employment Land Review is economic assessment work that was also done by independent consultants to give a different sort of market and demand-based perspective to the site selection approach. So we've set that information out in the hearing statement, and then simply the site has then been subject to obviously to officer assessment and to SA work, which has sort of further examined issues. We've set out the page references in the SA annexes. Again, I think this has come up at previous hearings in terms of Annex I, Appendix I, which sets out the individual site matrices for the sustainability appraisal. So that the page references are set out in the statement, and similarly Appendix K, which gives an audit trail of the various different stages throughout the sort of recent number of years that the different options and plan making work has developed. So that's set out there. So I guess really, yeah, our acceptance, which Mr. Elvin's already outlined, that a number of the policy criteria were already covered by other aspects of the plan. Otherwise, I guess that's just an introductory summary as to the Council's position in the key stages that the site has been through. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Dukes, you had some questions about the criteria, but you've also had some points about the size of the allocation. I've got that right, I think.
Yes, sir, thank you. I do welcome deletion of criteria 2, 5 and 6, because we have to remember that this site, it's already been in part through the council scrutiny in terms of an application on part of it already. So planning permission's all been granted, and that process itself revealed the material considerations and therefore the relevant criteria that you'd expect to see in a policy to make sure that site-specific issues are dealt with. But it's just the criteria in the policy, they're so generic for what we're talking about, because there really aren't any site-specific issues that require, to be addressed in particular. Things like detailed ecological assessment. I mean, it's absolute standard that an ecological assessment would be undertaken. The one that was undertaken previously in support of the applications, it made clear what various habitats exist across the site, and then it suggested the necessary mitigation. As with any planning application, it's just a typical situation that I don't think that the first criteria actually adds anything to the policy. Yes, we know that the site is near to a site of importance for nature conservation. We know about the SSSI, because they're all marked on the proposals map. So it's just making a note of what we already know and what would already come out of an ecological assessment, which would make clear those same designations as part of the report process. So I'm not really sure of the point of criteria 1. 2 is agreed, it can be deleted.
I'm really sorry, Mr. Dukes. Despite the fact that we're sitting quite closely together, I still can't hear you.
I'll speak a little louder. Sorry, sir. So yes, I'm just not sure that criterion 1 adds anything, given the fact that the proposals map's quite clear as to what nature designations sit in close proximity to the site. An ecological assessment would be required anyway, and that too needs to review, as part of the process, the nature conservation areas within certain distances of the site, and then it would refer to and require any necessary further works or investigations. So, yeah, I don't think it's site-specific. Criteria 2, we've agreed, can be deleted. Criteria 3, provide appropriate landscaping screening to assist in mitigation against the erosion. Right, if we actually look at the site itself, it's actually really well defined. We've got woodlands to the north, there's field boundaries to the south, east and west. The east is now developed with the actual industrial estate itself. So I'm not quite sure, again, what that criteria is actually adding to the situation, because it's, the landscaping is either already there or else it's quite evident where you'd actually add new landscaping. Criteria 4, again, it's so generic is the criterion. So it says, demonstrate that all traffic issues have been addressed in consultation with the council as necessary to ensure sustainable transport provision at the site is achievable. What is that exactly saying in terms of providing guidance to the applicant to give a steer as to what the council might expect? Because again, it's absolutely fundamental to an application that a transport statement at least would be submitted along with a transport plan. And then as part of that, you'd actually look at opportunities to address sustainable transport provision. But to say, to ensure transport provision at the site is achievable, well, what are we trying to achieve? I'd have expected to see some objectives so that we could actually measure whether sustainable transport was being achieved or not. But instead we've got a generic statement that adds no real guidance as to expectations. But just one thing, in the council's response from the highways team in respect to the last application on this site, they did actually make the point that this site is highly unsustainable insofar as it is set away from the rest of York. It's a settlement in effect. It's a major developed site in its own right. The point though is that it is still within acceptable walking distances, although to a limited catchment, but there's limited public transport provision. So, you know, what are we trying to achieve in saying ensure sustainable transport provision at the site is achievable? Are we trying to fundamentally change what's there at the moment, just improve what's there at the moment, or something different? I'll leave that as a question. Right, criterion 5 has been agreed to be removed. 6, again, can be removed because it's just generic. And then 7, address further surface water drainage issues due to the presence of aquifers, dikes and becks in the surrounding area. Again, surface water design is fundamental to the planning application process. So all that criterion is doing is putting a marker in the sand to say that it's known there are aquifers, dikes and becks in the surrounding area. Well, that is known as part of drainage strategy investigations. You know, in designing surface water drainage, you start by looking at your area, you look at your catchments, you work out where your flow is coming from, and then you look to see what mitigation is required if necessary. So again, I'm just not sure what that's actually adding in terms of site specifics.
Mr. Elvin?
Can I preface this by saying I suspect it might be easier if we change the last phrase of the first paragraph, rather in accordance with the following key principles, to having regard to the following issues. This is not intended to be prescriptive, and the problem with Mr. Duke's approach is it assumes that we know exactly what's going to be coming forward on the rest of the land. All we're doing are flagging up issues which are bound to occur here. And bearing in mind its countryside location and its surroundings, we think it's appropriate that ecology is flagged up as one issue that needs to be approached. We're not saying it's necessarily going to be an issue, but it is something that needs to be addressed. Similarly, with landscaping and with transport issues, to ensure that these issues are all properly addressed at the application stage. It's doing no more than highlighting the key issues that need to be addressed in any planning application that comes forward on the site. It's not setting criteria, it's intended to flag up issues for development management. I don't know whether Mr Wood has anything to add to that.
I don't really have a great deal to add. I think my general point was that the remaining criteria that we feel need to be in are identifying what the council thinks are particularly important factors, as Mr Elvin said, given the location, given the site, and the criteria that are proposed to remain. There is something in those about all of those factors that I've just mentioned, or something about the surrounding area. So I take, again, I agree that there's with Ms Duke's certain points that these factors will be picked up at the application stage, but I think it is important that a plan in providing certainty gives that guidance as to what are the really important issues that we want to see an application on this site addressing. Thank you.
I think, Mr Elvin, your suggested change of words at the end of the first paragraph does present what follows in a slightly different way. I think that's a useful suggestion.
And I think the same should be true of the other sites as well.
Yeah.
There are points that need to be considered, given the nature of the location.
Yeah, not a suggestion that there might be an issue in any of those, because yeah.
The nature of the location requires them to be addressed.
Does that assist, Ms Dukes?
I agree, it'd be more helpful if it just read as a list to say the following issues will need to be investigated, or something along the lines, so that at least it's a tick box to say, you know, the ecology report has actually looked at the management and mitigation, the drainage, surface water drainage design has looked at the presence of aquifers. It's the emphasis, isn't it? Because at the moment, to say these principles, they're not principles. So yeah, if we can change the emphasis, please, I think that would be more helpful. So it's like a to-do list of things just to double check. That might be more helpful as well to the Development Control Officer.
I'm content with that. Was there anything else about this?
I just wanted to ask Mrs Dukes, you mentioned a planning permission that's been granted on this site. Just so that we're clear, does that relate to it's site ST26, isn't it? Forgive me if I call it site SS21. I do find the numbering a little bit confusing. But yeah, so does the permission that's been granted relate to all of site ST26 or part of it or something else?
So it just relates to the eastern section. So there's a spine road that already runs through the estate, and it relates to the east and south of that spine road, joining on to existing business park. Do you have a plan, sir? Would it be useful for the application?
We're kind of sharing a copy of the policies map between us.
So I did put one in my statement of the actual extent of the application site.
And yeah, just to pick up on one of the criterion, the one about, which is it now? It's criterion for sustainable transport. I think what Mrs Dukes was saying is, well, it's not entirely clear what the plan is demanding, if it's making any particular demand or not in relation to sustainable transport. I mean, I suppose my question to the council is the council clear about that? You know, for example, is it necessary, is it a requirement to provide some kind of sustainable transport solution, whether it be buses or whatever, and if so, should the policy include that?
I don't think there's a particular requirement for a particular measure at this location, as you've just outlined. So I think the council's position is that given this site's location, that they really want us, in terms of the TA and measures coming forward for the applicants at that stage, to demonstrate that all has been done to promote sustainable transport provision in the area. There are other sites in the wider locality that will have a development influence in the area. There may be some opportunities for improvements associated with that, and I think it's just a more of a statement to really try to encourage a greater provision of sustainable transport measures given the site's location in a more countryside setting going forward, rather than requiring a particular measure.
It might be better to reword it, to be honest, to make that clear, to say something like demonstrate that all transport issues are considered including all options for sustainable provision of sustainable modes of transport, something along those lines. Then it's clear we're not targeting at something specific, but just asking a general question because of the location.
Mrs. Dukes, was there anything else on this particular site?
So it's just then down to the extent of the allocation itself. If you'd like me to address that matter.
Yes, if you could.
Yes, I've included in my statement reference to the representations that have been made through the actual local plan process, which date back to 2012, 2013, including then 2016, when we discussed with the council the actual extent of the opportunity at Elvington Airfield. Because there's... Mr. Elvin, your microphone's on. Because Elvington Airfield, it has a long history. This industrial park, it has a long history. It's already well established. There's an awful lot of demand, and it's completely constrained by the Greenbelt designation. The current owner, they regularly have inquiries as to whether new employers might locate here, and the main constraint is the Greenbelt. But if we look at the history of the site and how it's evolved with time, what we've got is the main airfield and the industrial park to the north. And then there's an actual existing access track that then curves southwards and then to the west. And at the end of that, there's two existing buildings that were originally hangars. And so those hangars have then been converted, and they are really large employers. There's a lot of traffic going up and down that road. So it already has the character of a disjointed industrial park, where the land in between is actually, on the north side, it's fairly scarred. So when you look at it on the ground, there's actually the history of this site, because it's associated with an airfield and the war. There's actually quite a lot of history still evident along that spine road that suggests that this site, it isn't a greenfield agricultural part of the rural character, wider rural character of the countryside, because of the scarring and the evidence of what's happened before, the fact that we've got buildings that are heavily used, lots of traffic, and it builds up to there being a character of an area that's quite well defined, and that definition is then further emphasised by the landscaping that's already present. Because in my statement, I've included the plan that shows the master plan, and it has the woodland already shown as existing. So there's an opportunity there that's much larger than the actual allocation as it is. And if we go back to that 2016 version of the plan, the council actually did intend to actually allocate the full extent of the phases 1 and 2 that are now built, and then 3 and 4 that carry on through the full extent of the opportunity. The other issue and reason for thinking about that wider site beyond its character and the opportunity for businesses to locate here is the drainage actually, because the solution at the moment for the application that's been allowed, the drainage solution for surface water is absolutely fine. It works. It's been granted planning permission, discharged, everything else. At the point where we're starting to look at the larger extent of the actual current allocation in the draft plan, we're starting to get to the point where actually we might need a more radical drainage solution than the one that's actually, that we might actually be able to accommodate with just that allocation. And that larger solution would be more efficient if it actually served a larger amount of land. Because basically we're going to need a bit of a pond. And the size of that pond makes more sense to take. So basically we've allocated the western section of the site on the south side of one of the existing hangars for a pond. And if you're going to build a pond, it needs to be of a decent size. And if we're thinking long term, the pond that's needed fills up a large part of that section directly south of the western hangar. If we were only to build out the current allocation, the pond needs to be half the size, which sounds okay, but if you're then talking about longer term development beyond the planned period, the fact that this estate is going to keep on being under demand, there's future potential, we've got a master plan here that talks about long-term development, then actually the long-term strategy for delivery of that pond in one go makes more sense than trying to divide it into two projects, because of the economics, the whole ecology, the opportunity to put in mitigation, and just plan properly for the opportunity. So there's lots of issues that add up to the fact that actually there's an opportunity beyond simply what the council has allocated, which seems to simply reflect the current economic target rather than actually what the market's demanding or where this allocation actually makes sense in terms of setting boundaries.
Sorry, just so I'm clear on that, Mrs. Dukes, do you say that the pond would be needed for the development proposed here during this plan period?
Yes, sir. We've managed not to need the pond for the Sheppey application, but for any further development, we're more than likely to need a pond. Pond's the most suitable and sensible solution, particularly if you look at the drainage hierarchy.
And is the green belt a constraint on the provision of a pond?
I would argue not, because we could, well, it is, digging a pond is engineering works, it would require planning permission. It would then probably fall under exceptional circumstance because it was a requirement of the development. But also, isn't there a, right, I haven't got a copy of the NPPF open because I'm imagining there's probably a criterion under the 2012 version that refers to drainage works. But the pond itself, it doesn't protrude above the surface level, so it wouldn't impact on the openness of the green belt. So I'm thinking aloud. Can you tell? Because it's that it's that thing of there's an argument and a case to say why the council could support an application for the pond, but it would potentially still sit outside of it being compliant with Greenbelt policy.
What the framework, I've got the previous version of the framework in front of me, and I'm not sure that this has changed, but I'm happy to be corrected about that. Certain other forms of development are also not inappropriate in Greenbelt, provided they preserve openness and do not conflict with the purposes. And these are bullet point 2, engineering operations. So as long as the pond preserved openness, which, well, you could argue about that, but and do not conflict with the purposes of including land in Greenbelt, then it wouldn't necessarily be an appropriate development.
So you've given me a chance to flick to paragraph 90.
It's 150B of the current NPPF, which of course will be the development management NPPF, of course. Well, until we get whatever they're going to issue this summer.
Yeah, so it's paragraph 90, isn't it? It refers to engineering works in the 2012. So it actually says, yes, certain other forms of development are also not in appropriate green belt. So yes, it could be justified as not conflicting because it wouldn't impact on the openness because it sits underneath the surface. The issue might then, one issue that might arise though is in introducing landscaping around it, because if you introduce a pond, you need to look at the ecology and create habitats, and some of those habitats might actually then start to include shrub planting and the like, which could be argued to impact on openness because they're above the surface and you can't see through them. There is an issue there potentially about...
Just so I'm clear, do you need planning permission to plant trees and other things?
No, sir, but it's part of the mitigation justification for the actual pond itself. So it'd be part of the justification for the pond. So it'd be material because you'd be delivering a benefit, but potentially there's a discussion about openness at the same time. So actually allocating that further tranche of land would take the site out of the green belt and therefore take away any arguments or any uncertainties about the delivery of the pond because it would actually be allocated as opposed to us having to demonstrate special circumstance.
Mr. Alvin?
First point, on the question of the amount of employment land which is required, you already have the debate on that from phase 2, and I'm not going to go back over that. We consider we've allocated enough land to meet the requirements for the planned period. The mere fact there may be market demand for this site is not a justification for allocating more, particularly given green belt issues. Secondly, a lot of the points that have been raised by Mrs. Jukes go to development management issues, and as for drainage, landscaping and the like, this is precisely why we have them listed as issues to be considered when considering a planning application. It's why they're in the list of bullet points. But there's no certainty at this stage without an application to know what form mitigation would take. But I entirely agree with your suggestion that open a balancing pond or a drainage pond or whatever it's going to be is not inconsistent with the green belt. As I say, paragraph 150B of the current NPPF, which is the NPPF which will apply to any development management decisions. Secondly, on the openness and landscaping, of course, openness does not just mean visual openness, as you well know. It's a strategic requirement, that is to say, freedom from inappropriate development. So planting trees is not per se inconsistent with openness. So all these points do are raise the importance of considering matters such as landscaping and drainage in terms of any application. It doesn't warrant the changing of greenbelt boundaries, whatever the demand, the market demand position might be, and it merely emphasises the point I was making last week, the importance of having defensible greenbelt boundaries for the purposes of control of development management decisions. Richard, do you want?
I don't really think I've too much to add. I think that the points I would make that clearly this site is part of a planned approach. That planned approach through the local plan includes the overall spatial strategy, includes meeting development need and involves site allocation. I think as Mr. Elvin has identified, if I go through the first two, we'll be reopening quite significant aspects from the previous sessions, but it's just to make that point that there's clearly a balance of considerations here that need to be assessed as to the quantum of land that is required as part of an allocation. Otherwise, I'd just be repeating points that have already been made. Thank you.
Yes, well, I don't really want to go reopen any of that phase 2 matter that we've already discussed, but I think, Mr. Dukes, I understand the points you make in your statement. I don't know if there's anything you want to add before we move on to the next one.
No, sir, thank you.
Okay. Passing over SS22. SS23, land at Northminster Business Park, ST19. Was there anything, Mr. Alvin, you wanted to touch on in the first instance on that one?
The points, as I made clear to Mr. Jukes before you came in, clearly in accordance with what I said earlier, it must be delivered in accordance with, should be replaced by having regard to the following issues. We agree that criterion 1 is not appropriate, doesn't add anything, nor criterion 2. The question of linkage can be addressed pursuant to criterion 5. Criterion 4, again, is covered by criterion 5. So that's 1, 2 and 4 can go. Residential amenity in 7, well, that would be addressed anyway, so that nothing specific that can go. And then archaeology, same point as under SS21, it's covered by D6. And I've got something else. Oh yes, the concern that Mrs. Jukes has raised about how can you mitigate and have an appropriate relationship with the surrounding countryside, I think that might be a wording issue because it's obviously not intended that they do both, but different parts of the boundary need to be addressed differently, having regard to those issues. So perhaps it should say provide a high-quality landscapes scheme where appropriate in order either to mitigate impacts and screen the developments and or to provide an appropriate relationship. It's different parts of the boundary. Some will need to be screened, some will need to address the wider landscape. But it's certainly not intended that you have to do both at the same time.
That's helpful. Mrs. Jukes? It looks like you've done most of the hearing before we started. Brilliant.
So no, I really welcome all the changes and the fact the council's listened. It's appreciated because it's about, at the end of the day, having a sensible policy that actually provides some guidance or the necessary checklist of issues to make sure that the case officer's helped and the applicant knows what information they need to include as part of the application. So are we proposing that the end of the first paragraph is also checked? Yeah. So it no longer says following, yeah. That's really helpful. And I welcome the change to the wording around the open space, the landscaping as well. So that just leaves criterion 5. Right, just a point about criterion 5. Optimise integration, connectivity and access through provision of new pedestrian, cycle, public transport and vehicular routes to ensure sustainable movement into and out of and through the site. Right, so planning permission has just been granted, well, not just, amazing how fast time passes. The DPD application, which is part of the site to the south of Pavers at the moment, as part of that, we actually addressed the matters in the criterion in that we made sure that the site had pedestrian cycle access from its entrance all the way through the existing park and on to then the main road up to the A59. As part of that application, all the necessary improvements to facilitate that connectivity have actually now been delivered in that there's new signage along the main road approach down to the gates. We've improved the footpaths to make sure that there's actually continuation all the way through. So a lot of, well, the main point of that criterion 5 has actually been addressed.
Would it help, sorry to interrupt, would it help if we adopted more general language as we did, as we suggested for SS21, which and sorry, I was whispering it when I had my microphone on. It was demonstrate that all transport issues have been addressed, including consideration of the provision of sustainable transport. So that it's just highlighting the point where those points have been addressed already. or where certain of those issues have already been addressed by the existing development, then obviously it will be covered, but we still need to address the development of the remainder of the site.
I appreciate the sentiment, but the issues here are actually slightly different. At Elvington, it is about sustainable transport and how you make the site more sustainable. Here, it's already highly sustainable. We're within walking distance of Park and Ride, walking distance of bus stops, walking distance of a train station.
Well,
it's actually about connectivity rather than the sustainable transport.
Sorry,
So,
Richard.
if that makes sense. So how about the site is in a sustainable location with access to Poplar and Bar, Park and Ride, offer frequent bus service access, blah, 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 blah. Applications should look to optimise integration, connectivity and access through, it's a change of emphasis, isn't it? I'm changing the paragraph around. Yeah. So we're saying it's already sustainable, so now we're looking to optimise that through linking it to those wider opportunities.
If just some general observations, really. I think clearly we accept that it is a sustainable location given the proximity to the Park and Ride. So I had some concern looking at the wording because it's seems to put a lot of onus in effect on just sort of pavements and pedestrian routes. So I think the broader wording would help, because I think the points we would make are the aspects such as layout on the new allocation, public realm, measures in a travel plan. There's all sorts of different things that could optimise the use of sustainable transport modes beyond just existing physical connections that may or may not have already been made. So we just want to make sure that it is optimised, and they will be the types of things that we will be looking for going forward. Thank you.
Perhaps in that case, replace it with the site is in a sustainable location and all transport issues should be considered, including optimising connectivity to sustainable modes of transport.
I feel that's a lot more helpful, yeah.
It's a much tighter qualification, so yeah, I'd be happy with that. Was there anything else on this one, Ms. Dukes?
So I did raise the issue as to the extent of allocation and where the boundaries should be drawn again. I'm not quite sure though, so if you're aware that there is actually an application in at the moment for land, right, so where the letters SF8, no, haven't, no, that's wrong allocation, let me pull up the right plan. What's going to help? Right, so directly to the west of Pavers, which is the long white bit that sticks out on the north side of the allocation.
Sorry, Ms. Dukes, I've got your Appendix 1 open in front of me, so
Right.
that would be the useful one to use.
If you just flick to Appendix 2, please, sir.
Yeah.
So where the words SF8 appear, the letters, there's an application in at the moment on land underneath those letters. Pavers, who are the grey square within the white area, on the north side of the allocation itself, they have an application in to extend westwards.
And it's in conflict with the current proposed allocation and the current Greenbelt boundary. It's not determined yet, and it may well be refused unless very special circumstances can be demonstrated. We don't think that application should drive the allocation in the local plan, nor the Greenbelt boundary setting.
Ms. Dukes?
So it's just, this is the thing, we're going back to the previous stage of the hearings because it is about, the amount of land, drawing sensible boundaries for the long term, And in an area like this, there's an opportunity to actually allocate a reasonable amount of land, going back to the 2016 version of the local plan, that allows for the future development of the estate. It's a really popular industrial estate. It's one of the key employment hubs in the whole of the district, and it is heavily constrained at the moment by the Greenbelt designation. The fact that we've secured various planning permissions demonstrating exceptional circumstance over the last few years for development in the Greenbelt is just driven by the demand for businesses to be located here. And it's just the worry that that employment hub is going to continue to be constrained going forward, which will, ultimately it affects the economy of York and the ability to attract different employers of different sizes. DPD have actually taken up a quite large extent now of that allocation, and that's being built at the moment because it's due for delivery, I think, in a couple of months' time when they're intending to move in. And it's then a case of, well, what's left? We've got buildings on the south side that form part of the allocation that are in agricultural use at the moment, which would come forward for conversion. And then literally there's not then much of the allocation left that's then meant to serve the next, the rest of the plan period. And what's left just isn't sufficient really, given the demand and where the market is and the opportunity of the business park to drive employment growth and support the economy in the district.
Okay, well, thank you. I certainly don't want to go over the phase 2 matters again, but I'll take your point. Mr. Evan, was there anything you wanted to say?
Yeah, I mean, it's back to the point I was making earlier. We've already addressed, and the plan is about managing demand, not simply allowing unconstrained market demand to have its head. And what Mr. Jukes says emphasises the importance of the allocation and fixing the Greenbelt boundaries. Of course, permissions have got through in the past under special circumstances, but that is prior to a more clearly defined local plan. And of course, once the plan's adopted, York will be in a better position to adopt an appropriate control over market demand. But as I say, we're not just dealing with unconstrained market demand here. We're dealing with locations that are sensitive and require management.
If I could just briefly add that, clearly, not to go back over your previous sessions, but clearly there's been discussion on the different economic models, economic forecasts, the sort of York economic outlook, that economic information that has underpinned the planned spatial strategy as a whole and those strategic policies, and similarly that economic analysis looking at the issues around demand forecasting and looking forwards as well. It clearly is a key part of the employment land review work as well, so it just makes the point that these factors have been considered as part of the overall planned approach. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we move on to SS24 and ST37? Mr. Elvin, was there anything you wanted to say about this one?
No.
Mr. Wood?
Well, we don't have criteria to work through on this one, so it's a shorter, tighter policy approach. Clearly, as we've set out in our statement, there is a different approach, really, route that this site has taken forward as opposed to the two that we've just discussed. So it is acknowledged that this site location was considered through the site selection approach, and due to its location within one of the green wedges, was not taken forward previously through the site selection approach. So, for example, the site doesn't feature within sort of the employment land review and the economic assessment work. Now, what's then happened since then is that the applications have come forward on the site in 2018 for car storage uses. In effect, the determination of those planning applications has provided a means of providing, sorry, using the word providing too many times there, but a detailed assessment of this site and the issues, and consent was given for the car storage uses on the site. And as we set out in our statement, without going into too much detail in our application, but the council were satisfied that the proposals would maintain openness. There are important views of the Minster. So, for example, a viewing corridor forms part of the agreed site master plan, and clearly there's reference in the policy to that master plan, which in case, particularly in terms of dealing with these more strategic issues, is important. And similarly, the landscaping scheme that was brought forward with the application, again in combination with the location and layout and type of the uses, and the viewing corridor was considered to be acceptable. So that was a sort of situation as to how this site then came forward in terms of being considered as an employment site, that it has got consent. The site then has been subject through the SA process. So again, the references are set out for the matrices through that process. And again, as we've set out in our statement, we then set out how this site then makes a positive contribution to meeting the development needs and the spatial strategy of the plan, but acknowledging the different route that it's taken to be included as an allocation. Thank you.
Have reserved matters applications come forward? I'm just asking this because we just want to be sure that the master plan that's secured through the outline permission is something that, I'm not quite sure what the right form of words is here, but it's not going, that outline permission isn't going to lapse, and therefore you no longer have in effect that master plan that's referred to in the policy.
I think if we could come back on that and confirm that back to you, I just need to check with the council officers as to the exact position on the applications, or go on the portal myself and check, but we can confirm back to you on the position.
Yeah, if you would, because I mean, if it might be that the form of wording might need to be altered depending on the circumstance in relation to that permission, I suppose. But yeah, if you could just add that to the homework list, that would be great.
It might work better in accordance with an agreed site master plan, and then just take the reference to the existing outline consent out, because then it opens the door to something else coming forward that might be different.
I think that sounds a very helpful suggestion. Thank you.
I'll add it to my list.
Excellent. Anything else we need to cover on this particular policy? In which case we've come to the end of matter 6 before it gets too hot. So mission accomplished. That wasn't planned, but there we are. Good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ruff and Mr. Wood. Mr. Dukes.
Just to give you an update, I have redrafted the student housing policies as we discussed last week, particularly age 7 on the off-campus. And because we'll need to viability test the off-site contributions proposals, that's in the hands of the council just to look at what the thresholds will be, and it'll be subject to the usual viability open book issue. But we just need to test the thresholds first, but it will incorporate the factors that I referred to last week. And then I'll run it past Mr. Tucker when he's recovered from COVID.
Yes. Yes, there is that date to try and organise as well, but it's not looking like week commencing 5th September is going to work.
No, it looks like it's going to be probably the 13th, which is the beginning of the second week, before I disappear.
Well, oh yeah. No, Simon's not available that week. We'll have a chat about it.
Because my availability ceases on the 14th, and it's nothing else until October, I'm afraid. Well, I'll see what if you want to speak to your colleague at Warrington and twist his arm to get Mr. Tucker.
I've already tried.
Oh, right. Okay.
And I'm not going to try and twist Kevin's arm, so I'm not even going there. Okay, well, leave it with us, but it's useful to know. Thank you. Okay, until tomorrow at 9:30 then. Thank you.
And hopefully it should be cooler tomorrow. Do you want to keep casual dress tomorrow?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, you may have noticed that just as a general rule of thumb, I tend to dress more casually than many inspectors do in any event. So, given the temperature situation, I'm more than happy for people to come casually for the rest of the day.
Yeah, and can I just raise, for reasons which I won't bore you with, I wasn't consulted about timetabling next Monday. And that presents me with problems because I've got commitments on Sunday and have a long journey, as you know. What Mr. Henderson and I are planning is we will both come up early, but it'll take me longer to get here, although yesterday I beat Mr. Henderson because of the train situation. And Mr. Henderson will do Monday morning, and I should be able to get here by lunchtime, so I hope that will work. So we can still make Monday work.
Yeah, that's fine by me. From our side of things, I'll be here next week. Mr. Griffiths won't be.
Well, I hope it's a holiday.
It's school holidays, and
So no is the other word.
yeah. But yes, I'm doing a reciprocal week in September on my own.
Good luck.
Thank you.